She was about to lose her daughter, until a forgotten journal changed everything. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The ancient wood stove refused to light. Tina Williams stared at it in frustration, her trembling hands fumbling with the matches as the howling Colorado wind rattled the cabin's windows. Outside, snow fell in thick, unforgiving curtains, piling against the dilapidated porch of the mountain cabin that now represented their last refuge. Her once manicured nails were already chipped, hands red and raw from the cold that seemed to seep through the cabin's poorly insulated walls. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been signing quarterly reports in a corner office with a view of downtown Denver. Now, at 58, she was a widow with nothing but debt, disgrace, and a traumatized 10-year-old daughter. "Mom," the small voice came from behind her. Tina turned to see Valerie huddled under a pile of musty blankets they'd found in a trunk. Her daughter's face unnaturally pale, lips taking on a bluish tinge that sent a spike of terror through Tina's heart. "Just a minute, sweetheart. I'll get it going." Her voice betrayed none of the panic rising inside her. She struck another match, coaxing the kindling to catch, silently begging the ancient stove to cooperate. The cabin had belonged to her late husband Richard's grandfather, a place so rarely mentioned that Tina had almost forgotten its existence until the lawyer had mentioned it as the only asset the creditors hadn't seized. When Richard died unexpectedly 6 months ago, the truth had unraveled with horrifying speed. Their savings emptied, massive gambling debts revealed, their beautiful suburban home mortgaged to the hilt and promptly foreclosed upon. The luxury SUV parked outside the cabin, loaded with the few possessions they'd been allowed to keep, would likely be repossessed within weeks. Valerie's teeth chattered audibly. Tina abandoned the stove and rushed to her daughter, wrapping her arms around the small, shivering body. The girl had grown increasingly withdrawn since her father's death, but the final blow had come when they'd been forced to leave her prestigious private school, her friends, and the only life she'd ever known. Now, she hardly spoke at all. "Val? Sweetheart, talk to me." Tina brushed dark hair from her daughter's forehead, alarmed at how cold the skin felt beneath her fingers. Valerie's eyes fluttered, unfocused. Hypothermia. The word flashed in Tina's mind with clinical clarity. Without proper heat, without proper shelter, her daughter would die. The thought crystallized every desperate emotion of the past months into a single clarifying purpose. Tina Williams, former senior accountant, disgraced widow, failed mother, would not lose her daughter. Not tonight, not ever. She wrapped Valerie in every blanket they had, placed her as close to the stove as possible, and made a split-second decision. Richard's grandfather's cabin was remote, terrifyingly so, but she'd noticed chimney smoke from a property perhaps a mile down the winding mountain road. Neighbors, help. "Val, listen to me." She cupped her daughter's face. "I need to get help. I'm going to find our neighbors. You stay wrapped up right here. I'll be back very soon with help. Do you understand?" Valerie's nod was almost imperceptible. Tina pressed a kiss to her forehead, threw on her inadequate city coat, and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Snow immediately soaked through her designer boots, purchased for Denver winters spent walking. From heated parking garages to heated buildings, not for trudging through actual wilderness. The wind clawed at her face, stealing her breath. The darkness between the whirling snowflakes was absolute, broken only by the faint glow of her phone's flashlight. No signal, of course, just enough battery to light her way. Tina put her head down and walked. Each step was a battle against the accumulating snow and her own rising terror. The image of Valerie's pale face drove her forward when her body screamed to turn back. The road twisted treacherously downhill, invisible beneath. The snow. Twice she fell, the second time rolling several feet down an embankment, her soaked clothes now freezing against her skin. The minutes stretched endlessly. Her extremities went from painful to frighteningly numb. Still, she pushed forward, squinting desperately for any sign of light through the storm. When she finally saw it, a warm yellow glow through the trees, she nearly sobbed with relief. The porch light illuminated a sturdy log home, smoke rising comfortingly from its chimney. Tina stumbled the final yards, nearly collapsing against the door as she pounded with the last of her strength. The door swung, open to reveal an elderly man with white hair and a lined face creased in concern. Behind him stood a woman of similar age, her expression shifting from annoyance to alarm as she took in Tina's condition. "My God," the woman gasped. "Frank, help her in." "My daughter," Tina managed through chattering teeth. "Cabin up the road. Hypothermia. Please." Frank was already grabbing a heavy coat and shouting instructions to his wife. "Eleanor, get her warm. I'll take the truck." Tina fought to stay conscious as Eleanor helped her inside, trying to give directions to the cabin between violent shivers. The last thing she remembered before darkness closed in was the sound of a truck engine roaring to life, and the desperate prayer that they would reach Valerie in time. When she woke, Tina was wrapped in thick blankets before a roaring fireplace. For one disorienting moment, she thought the entire nightmare had been a dream, that she was still in her old life, that Richard was still alive, that they hadn't lost everything. Then reality crashed back. "Valerie," she struggled to sit up. "Easy now." Eleanor's gentle hand pressed her back. "Your daughter's fine. She's sleeping right over there." Tina turned her head to see Valerie on a sofa across the room. Color returned to her cheeks, chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. The relief was so overwhelming that tears sprang to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to—" "Don't you worry about thanks," Eleanor interrupted, pressing a mug of something hot into Tina's hands. "Frank says that old Harper cabin hasn't been lived in for decades. What on earth are you doing up there in the middle of winter?" The question held no judgment, only genuine curiosity, but it still scraped against Tina's raw pride. How could she explain the catastrophic fall from grace? The shameful discovery that her seemingly perfect husband had secretly gambled away their entire life savings and left them drowning in debt. The humiliation of watching everything they owned sold at auction. "It's all we have left," she said, simply the words burning her throat more than the hot tea. Eleanor and Frank exchanged a look loaded with unspoken communication, the kind that comes from decades of marriage. "Well," Frank said finally, settling into an armchair with a sigh, "you can't go back there tonight. Storm's getting worse. You'll stay here until morning, and then we'll figure things out." His tone brooked no argument, and Tina had no strength left to protest. As she sipped the tea, watching the steady rise and fall of her daughter's chest, a terrible clarity settled over her. They had nearly died tonight, would have died, if not for the kindness of strangers, and this was only their first night in their new reality. Somehow, she had to find a way to transform this desperate situation. For Valerie's sake, she had to become someone new, someone who could not just survive, but rebuild from the ashes of their former life. As the fire crackled and her daughter slept safely across the room, Tina made a silent vow. This would be the lowest point. From here, they would rise. Morning revealed a transformed world. Sunlight sparkled off pristine snow, and the mountains surrounding the valley stood like sentinels against a perfectly blue sky. It was beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel given their circumstances. Frank drove them back to the cabin. In his ancient but well-maintained truck, the vehicle skillfully navigating roads that had seemed impassable the night before. Eleanor had packed them a box of essentials, food, matches, extra blankets, and a promise to check on them later. "The stove's temperamental," Frank explained as he got it roaring with practiced ease. "Trick is to clean out the flue first." Probably been clogged for years. The cabin looked even more dilapidated in daylight. What had once perhaps been a charming rustic retreat had deteriorated into a sagging structure with gaps in the walls, a partially collapsed back porch, and a roof that clearly leaked in multiple places, judging by the water stains on the ceiling. Valerie stood silently by the window, watching Frank's demonstration with hollow eyes that broke Tina's heart. The vibrant, chatty girl who'd once organized elaborate tea parties for her stuffed animals had retreated so deeply inside herself that Tina sometimes feared she might never find her way back. "Town's about 7 miles down the mountain," Frank said as he prepared to leave. "General store, small school, post office, not much else. Folks can be a bit standoffish to newcomers, but they're good people underneath." "Thank you again," Tina said, the words entirely inadequate for what they'd done. "I don't know what we would have—" Frank waved her thanks away. "Been up here 40 years. Mountain takes care of its own." He paused, glancing at Valerie with grandfatherly concern. "School's small but decent. Teacher's name is Ms. Patterson. Tell her Frank Holbrook sent you." After he left, the silence in the cabin seemed to pulse with all the things Tina couldn't say. How could she explain to her 10-year-old that they were now poverty-stricken outcasts, that her father, whom she still mourned, had secretly destroyed their lives with his gambling addiction, that the fancy school and ballet lessons and summer camps were all gone forever? Instead, she focused on the immediate needs. "Let's explore our new home, shall we? There must be some supplies here somewhere." The cabin consisted of a main room with the wood stove, a tiny kitchen with an ancient pump sink, a small bedroom, and what might generously be called a bathroom, essentially. An enclosed space with a rusted shower stall and a toilet that mercifully still flushed thanks to a well system. A narrow ladder led to a small loft space under the eaves. Their exploration yielded meager results. Some ancient canned goods, of questionable safety, basic tools, a kerosene lamp with no kerosene, and furniture covered in decades of dust. Tina tried to maintain an enthusiastic facade, pointing out the character of the rough-hewn beams and the potential of the space. But Valerie's silence only deepened. When they ventured into town later that day, Tina's luxury SUV looking absurdly out of place on the rough mountain roads, things went from bad to worse. The general store owner's friendly expression cooled visibly when Tina introduced herself. "Williams?" he repeated, eyes narrowing. "Any relation to the Harpers?" "My late husband was Richard Williams. I believe his grandfather was Theodore Harper, who owned our cabin." The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Other customers paused their shopping to stare, and the owner's smile disappeared entirely. "Well," he said finally, ringing up their purchases with brusque efficiency, "that'll be 47.82s. The prices were significantly higher than they should have been, but Tina was too exhausted to argue. One of her last functioning credit cards covered the purchase, for now. Outside, an older woman bumped into Tina without apologizing, giving her a look that could only be described as hostile. Valerie pressed closer to her side, tension radiating from her small body. "Is there a public library in town?" Tina asked the woman impulsively, hoping to find both information and a warm place to spend time that wouldn't cost money. "End of Main Street," the woman replied curtly, "though I doubt they have the fancy books you're probably used to." The library, at least, offered them a warmer welcome. The librarian, a thin woman with prematurely grey hair and kind eyes, showed no reaction to their name, and eagerly gave Valerie a tour of the children's section, while Tina used the computer to check her emails. The news was uniformly grim. Another rejection for a remote accounting position. A notification that the SUV would indeed be repossessed within 2 weeks. A formal letter from the law firm handling Richard's estate, informing her that final probate had closed and all assets had been liquidated to pay creditors, leaving them with nothing but the nearly worthless cabin. That night, as Valerie finally fell asleep in the small bedroom they would share until Tina could make the loft habitable, she allowed herself a moment of absolute despair. Curled on a threadbare sofa in the main room, she buried her face in her hands and wept silently, the weight of her situation crushing down on her. They had no income, dwindling resources, a hostile community, and winter was just beginning. Her professional credentials meant nothing in this remote mountain town, and her age made online employment a challenge in a field that increasingly favored younger, cheaper labor. The cabin was barely habitable now. What would happen when the food ran out, when the last credit card was maxed, when the pipes inevitably froze? Would they take Valerie from her? The thought sent a spike of pure terror through Tina's chest. No. She straightened her spine, wiping away the tears with angry determination. She had spent 25 years managing complex financial systems and solving seemingly impossible accounting puzzles. She had a brilliant mind for patterns and solutions. She could not fail at this most important calculation of all, their survival. Tomorrow, she decided, they would truly begin rebuilding. She would find out why the town seemed to hate her husband's family. She would make this cabin livable. She would find a way to generate income. She would give Valerie stability and safety, and a reason to speak again. As if affirming her resolution, the wood stove crackled suddenly, flames dancing higher through the iron grate. Tina watched them, finding an unexpected comfort in their wild, determined light. They would survive. This winter, they would find their way. They had no other choice. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Tina woke before sunrise, her body aching from the lumpy sofa, but her mind surprisingly clear. She had spent half the night making lists in an old notebook, organizing their challenges into manageable tasks with the same methodical precision she had once applied to corporate audits. First priority, make the cabin truly habitable before the next storm hit. Second, find transportation before the SUV was repossessed. Third, discover why the town seemed to despise them and whether that hostility could be overcome. Fourth, and most daunting, find a way to generate income here in this remote mountain community where her corporate skills seemed as useful as knowing conversational Latin. She stoked the wood stove and set water to boil on its surface, then stepped outside to assess the cabin in the growing light. The porch sagged dangerously on one side, several windows were cracked, and the roof. She winced at the obvious signs of water damage. But the foundation seemed solid, and the basic structure was sound despite years of neglect. Frank and Eleanor arrived just as Tina was making a second pot of tea, bringing not just additional supplies, but valuable advice. "Roof's got to be fixed before anything else," Frank declared after a thorough inspection. "Winter up here'll destroy the place otherwise." "I don't know the first thing about roofing," Tina admitted, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. A lifetime of paying professionals for such work now seemed like a luxury beyond imagining. "Could teach you," Frank offered, "but easier if I just do it. Got supplies left from when we redid our place 3 years back." Tina started to protest, but Eleanor cut her off. "Let him. Man needs to feel useful, and it's getting too cold for him to putter around our place." The arrangement evolved naturally. Frank would help repair the cabin in exchange for Tina keeping their books for their small honey business. "Never did get the hang of all those tax forms," he confessed. "Been meaning to find someone who could make sense of them." As Frank worked on the roof, Tina spent the morning cleaning decades of dust and grime from the main room, while Valerie watched silently from her perch on the windowsill. By afternoon, the girl had begun handing her mother cleaning supplies without being asked, a small sign of engagement that Tina celebrated internally as a major victory. "Would you like to help me clean out the kitchen cabinets?" she asked, keeping her tone light, careful not to pressure. Valerie considered this, then gave a small nod. Together they emptied ancient cupboards, discovering mouse-chewed packages and rusted cans alongside a few usable items, cast-iron cookware, sturdy ceramic plates, and surprisingly, a full set of handmade pottery mugs, glazed in vibrant blues and greens. "These are beautiful," Tina murmured, carefully washing one in the sink. "Theo made those," called Eleanor from where she was sweeping the bedroom. "Had a pottery wheel in the shed out back. Quite the artist, from what Frank remembers." "Theo, my husband's grandfather?" Tina frowned. Richard had rarely mentioned his family, claiming they had died when he was young. Yet another lie in a marriage, she now realized, had been built on them. "Theodore Harper," Eleanor confirmed. "Lived here till he passed. Oh, must be 40 years ago now. Quite a character, botanist, potter, bit of a hermit toward the end." The shed, Eleanor mentioned, turned out to be a small structure half hidden behind overgrown junipers at the back of the property. Inside, covered in decades of dust, stood an old pottery wheel, shelves of dried clay, glazes long since hardened in their jars, and, most surprising, dozens of botanical illustrations tacked to the walls, their colors still vibrant despite the years. "Mom, look." Valerie's voice, small but clear, startled Tina from her examination of the drawings. Her daughter stood before a tall bookshelf, pointing at a row of leather-bound journals. The sound of Valerie's voice, so rare these days, brought tears to Tina's eyes. "What did you find, sweetheart?" "Books," Valerie said, reaching for one, "with pictures." The journal opened to reveal meticulous handwritten notes alongside detailed illustrations of mountain plants, labeled with both common and Latin names, along with notes about their properties and uses. Theodore Harper had been documenting the local flora with scientific precision and artistic skill. "He was a botanist," Tina murmured, carefully turning pages yellowed with age. "Best in these parts," Frank said from the doorway. "Folk used to come from miles around when they needed remedies, had a way with plants like nobody else." Eleanor nodded. "That's partly why—" She stopped herself, exchanging a glance with Frank. "Why what?" Tina pressed. Frank sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "Why, there's bad blood. Theo knew things about local plants nobody else did. Had remedies that worked when doctors couldn't help. Town doctor back then, fella named Chamberlain, claimed Theo was practicing medicine without a license, tried to run him off. But when Chamberlain's own daughter took sick with something he couldn't cure, he swallowed his pride and came to Theo." "And Theo helped?" Tina asked. "Way I heard it, he refused," Frank said. "Said he wouldn't help a man who'd tried to destroy him. Girl died, town turned against Theo, and he turned against them right back. Stayed up here alone till he died." The story settled over them like the dust they'd disturbed, a legacy of bitterness Tina had inherited without knowing. "But that was decades ago," she protested. "Why would they still hold it against us now?" "Mountain folk have long memories," Eleanor said simply, "and the Chamberlains still own half the businesses in town." That night, after everyone had left, and Valerie had fallen asleep, Tina sat at the ancient kitchen table with one of Theodore's journals open before her. The detailed notes on local plants and their medicinal properties were fascinating, even to someone with no botanical background. His passion for the subject leapt from every carefully documented observation and lovingly rendered illustration. On a whim, she carried the journal up to the loft space, which she'd begun clearing for her own bedroom to give Valerie privacy below. As she swept decades of dust from the sloped ceiling, her broom dislodged a loose board, revealing a hidden space behind the wall. Curious, she pried the board away. Inside the small cavity sat a metal box. Tina lifted it out with trembling hands. half hoping for some forgotten cash or valuables that might ease their precarious situation. Instead, she found more journals, these older and more worn than those in the shed, along with a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For my grandson." Richard had never opened it. Had he even known it existed? Tina hesitated only briefly before breaking the seal. The letter inside, written in the same meticulous hand as the journals, was dated just weeks before Theodore Harper's death. "My dear grandson," it began, "if you are reading this, then perhaps you have found your way back to the mountains that have been our family's true home for generations. I have left you what little I possess, this cabin, my books, and most importantly, knowledge that could either fade with my passing or flourish in new hands." The letter went on to explain that Theodore had spent decades documenting and cultivating rare medicinal herbs native to the specific microclimate of their mountain valley, plants with properties that modern medicine had yet to fully understand or replicate. His work had been his life's passion, driven by the belief that nature held healing secrets that should belong to all, not locked away by pharmaceutical companies for profit. "The formulas in the Red Journal are my legacy to you," the letter concluded. "Use them wisely and with compassion, the very qualities the Chamberlains accused me of lacking. Perhaps in your generation, old wounds might finally heal." Tina sat back on her heels, the letter trembling in her hands. Richard had never mentioned any of this, had likely never known it existed. Yet here was a potential legacy that had nothing to do with gambling debts or financial ruin. She reached for the red journal mentioned in the letter, carefully opening its fragile cover. Inside were detailed formulas for tinctures, salves, and teas, each with specific instructions for preparation and use. The handwriting was cramped, but perfectly legible, the voice of a man speaking across decades with absolute conviction in his life's work. Something warm and unexpected unfurled in Tina's chest. The first flicker of hope she'd felt since Richard's death. These journals contained knowledge, and knowledge had value. Perhaps Theodore Harper's forgotten legacy might hold the key to their future in this unwelcoming mountain community. She descended the ladder with the journals clutched to her chest, her mind already racing with possibilities. Tomorrow, she would begin reading them systematically. Tomorrow, she would start to understand exactly what Theodore had left behind. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would take the first step toward building something new from the ruins of their old life. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Tina slept deeply and without dreams. Valerie's fever began 3 days later. At first, Tina mistook the flushed cheeks and unusual irritability for the emotional aftermath of their upheaval. But by evening, her daughter was burning up, her breathing labored, and a troubling wheeze accompanying each exhalation. "How long has she been like this?" Eleanor asked, her lined face grave, as she placed a weathered hand on Valerie's forehead. "The fever started this morning, but the breathing, it's gotten worse in the last few hours." Tina fought to keep her voice steady, despite the terror clawing at her throat. Medical emergencies in their old life had meant a quick drive to state-of-the-art facilities, premium insurance, and immediate care. Here, miles from the nearest clinic, with no car and dwindling funds, every parent's ordinary worry transformed into potentially catastrophic proportions. "Sounds like lung infection," Eleanor's mouth tightened. "There's a clinic in town, but Doc Chamberlain only comes up from Denver twice a week. Today's not one of his days." "Chamberlain?" Tina's head snapped up. "As in, his grandson." Frank confirmed from the doorway. "Runs the only medical practice in the county. I could drive you down to the emergency room in Glenwood Springs, but that's nearly 2 hours in good weather." Tina looked down at Valerie, whose breathing was becoming more labored by the minute. "We don't have 2 hours," she said, maternal. Instinct overriding any uncertainty. "She needs help now. The prospect of seeking help from a chamberlain, given what she now knew about the family history, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. But Valerie's health outweighed any decades-old feud. "Can you get us to the clinic? Maybe there's a nurse or someone who can help until the doctor returns." The town clinic was a small, well-maintained building at the end of Main Street. The lights were on despite the late hour, and Tina nearly sobbed with relief when they pulled into the empty parking lot. Frank carried Valerie inside, while Tina held the doors. The receptionist, a young woman with a practical ponytail and skeptical eyes, informed them that Dr. Chamberlain wouldn't be back until Thursday, but the nurse practitioner might be able to help. "What's the insurance?" she asked, sliding a clipboard across the counter. We don't." Tina stumbled over the words, shame burning her cheeks. "We're new to the area. I haven't arranged." The receptionist's expression cooled further. "It's $175 for an uninsured visit due at time of service." Tina fumbled for her wallet, mentally calculating the dwindling balance on her last functioning credit card. Would it even go through? Her hands trembled as she extracted the plastic lifeline. "She can't breathe properly," she said, desperation edging her voice. "Please." Something in her tone must have reached through the woman's professional detachment. She glanced at Valerie, whose wheezing was now audible across the waiting room, and pressed a button under the desk. "Nancy will see you now," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Room 3. The nurse practitioner was efficient and kind, her expert hands moving over Valerie with gentle precision. "Respiratory infection," she confirmed after a brief examination. "Becoming bronchial. She needs antibiotics and a steroid to reduce the inflammation in her lungs." Relief flooded Tina until the nurse continued. "I'll write the prescriptions, but you'll need to get them filled at the pharmacy in Glenwood Springs. Nothing closer is open this late." 2 hours away," Tina whispered, the brief relief evaporating. "Isn't there anything—" "I can give her a breathing treatment now. That should help temporarily," Nancy offered, "but she really needs those medications. The infection could worsen quickly without them." The treatment helped enough that Valerie's breathing eased slightly, but the blue tinge around her lips remained. As they left the clinic, prescriptions in hand but no way to fill them before. Morning, Tina felt a desperation unlike anything she'd experienced before. Frank drove them back to the cabin in silence, his usual stoicism replaced by obvious concern. "First thing tomorrow, I'll drive you down to Glenwood," he promised, as he helped carry a semi-conscious Valerie inside. But tomorrow seemed an eternity away as Tina sat beside her daughter's bed, listening to each labored breath and feeling more helpless than she ever had during the financial catastrophe that had brought them here. What good were her analytical skills, her years of education, her professional achievements, if she couldn't even obtain basic medicine for her child? As midnight approached and Valerie's fever climbed higher, Tina found herself drawn to Theodore Harper's journals, piled neatly on the kitchen table where she'd been studying them. The red one, the one containing his formulas, seemed to call to her with particular urgency. "This is madness," she whispered to herself as she flipped through the pages, searching for anything related to respiratory ailments. "I need real medicine, not century-old folk remedies." Yet desperation pushed her onward. Near the middle of the journal, she found detailed notes on a preparation for winter lung complaints, with ingredients she recognized from her exploration of the property. Wild thyme that still grew stubbornly along the south-facing slope, pine resin from the trees surrounding the cabin, and honey, which Frank and Eleanor had in abundance. Theodore's instructions were precise. Proportions, preparation methods, dosage, all carefully documented in his meticulous hand. At the bottom of the page, a note. Effectively reduced inflammation in James Holbrook's youngest, winter of 1947, when pneumonia threatened. Holbrook, Frank's family? The coincidence seemed too specific to ignore. Driven by a mother's desperate determination, Tina bundled herself against the cold and ventured outside with a flashlight. The wild thyme was where Theodore's notes indicated. It would be still fragrant despite the season. Pine resin required more searching, but she eventually collected enough from the trees nearest the cabin. Back inside, she followed Theodore's instructions with the precision that had made her an excellent accountant. Steeping the thyme in boiling water, stirring in the exact proportion of pine resin and honey, straining the mixture twice through. Clean cloth. The resulting liquid smelled strongly of forest and sweetness, steam rising from its surface like a promise. Tina hesitated only briefly before waking Valerie enough to help her drink a small amount, diluted as Theodore had instructed. "Just until morning," she whispered, smoothing her daughter's sweat-dampened hair. "Just to help until we can get the real medicine." She sat beside the bed, applying cool compresses to Valerie's forehead and listening anxiously for any change in her breathing. After an hour, she noticed the wheeze had softened slightly. By the second hour, Valerie's breathing had deepened, the desperate struggle for air easing into something closer to normal sleep. By dawn, the fever had broken. Tina, bleary-eyed from her vigil, placed a hand on her daughter's forehead and nearly wept to find it cool to the touch. Valerie's eyes fluttered open, clear and alert, for the first time in 24 hours. "Mom," she whispered, her voice hoarse but stronger. "I'm hungry." When Frank arrived at 7, prepared to make the long drive to Glenwood Springs for the prescriptions, he found Valerie sitting up in bed, sipping broth and breathing almost normally. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, feeling her forehead with the back of his hand. He glanced at Tina, taking in her exhausted but triumphant expression. "What happened?" Tina showed him Theodore's journal and explained what she'd done. Instead of the skepticism she expected, Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Theo helped my aunt once, back when I was just a boy. Doctor had given up on her, but Theo's remedies pulled her through." He ran a weathered finger over the handwritten notes. "Folks used to say he could find medicine in plants nobody else even noticed, called him a witch doctor behind his back, but came running when they needed him." They still took Valerie to the clinic later that day, where Nancy, the nurse practitioner, expressed astonishment at the improvement in her condition. The prescribed antibiotics would ensure the infection cleared completely, but the crisis had undeniably passed. "What did you do?" Nancy asked, genuine curiosity in her voice as she listened to Valerie's lungs. Tina hesitated, unsure how the medical professional would react to her desperate experiment with folk medicine. "I found an old remedy in some journals that belonged to my husband's grandfather, Theodore Harper. I was desperate and—" "Harper?" Nancy looked up sharply. "You have Theodore Harper's formulas?" "Some of them, in his journals." Something that might have been respect flickered across Nancy's face. "My grandmother used to talk about him. Said he could heal just about anything with his preparations." She lowered her voice. "Don't tell Dr. Chamberlain I said so, but half the old-timers around here still swear by Harper's remedies over modern medicine." A slight smile, "including my own grandfather, who'd sooner drink pine sap than take an antibiotic." As they left the clinic, prescriptions filled at the small dispensary Nancy had opened specially for them, Tina felt a subtle shift in the town's energy. The receptionist nodded to her with something approaching friendliness. An older man held the door, tipping his hat. "Word travels fast in small towns," Frank commented as they walked to his truck, "especially when it involves a Harper remedy that works." The implications of this sank in slowly as they drove back to the cabin. Theodore Harper's journals weren't just historical curiosities or family heirlooms. They contained knowledge that might still be valuable. Knowledge that had saved her daughter when modern medicine was out of reach. Knowledge that might possibly offer them a path forward in this community that had initially seemed so hostile. That evening, as Valerie slept peacefully and the wood stove crackled with comfortable warmth, Tina pulled all of Theodore's journals from their various hiding places and arranged them chronologically on the kitchen table. She found a fresh notebook and began to organize what she'd learned so far, her accountant's mind categorizing and cross-referencing the scattered information into a coherent system. If Theodore's remedies truly worked, and Valerie's remarkable recovery suggested they did, then perhaps this knowledge could form the foundation of something sustainable for them in this remote mountain community. As she worked late into the night, transcribing and organizing Theodore's scattered notes, Tina felt something she hadn't experienced since before Richard's death: purpose. Not merely survival, but the possibility of creating something meaningful from the ashes of their old life. What if a disgraced accountant and her traumatized daughter could find healing in the same mountain herbs that had sustained Theodore? Decades ago? It was a fragile hope, but for now it was enough to carry her forward into whatever tomorrow might bring. Will the community that has shunned them begin to soften as word of Valerie's recovery spreads? What secrets might still be hidden in Theodore's neglected legacy? 3 weeks later, the cabin had undergone a transformation almost as dramatic as Tina's shifting perspective. Frank's expert repairs had sealed the leaking roof and reinforced the sagging porch. The walls, now properly insulated with materials salvaged from the town's small hardware store, kept out the worst of the mountain cold. The wood stove, cleaned and properly maintained, provided reliable heat that reached even the furthest corners. Inside, the musty odor of abandonment had given way to the comforting sense of pine and herbal preparations. A dozen small jars lined the kitchen shelves, each containing remedies Tina had carefully recreated from Theodore's journals. Salves for winter-chapped skin, tinctures for headaches and digestive troubles, teas for sleeplessness and anxiety. "You've got the touch," Eleanor observed one afternoon, watching Tina measure dried ingredients with precise movements. "Most folks would just eyeball it, but you're as exact as Theo himself was." "Numbers have always made sense to me," Tina replied, suddenly self-conscious about her methodical approach. "Measurements, proportions, ratios, they're a language I understand." What she didn't say was how deeply satisfying she found this work. Unlike the abstract financial calculations that had dominated her career, these formulas yielded tangible results she could see, smell, and touch. There was something grounding about working with materials gathered from the land around them, following instructions left by a man whose blood ran in her daughter's veins. Valerie, still quiet but gradually emerging from her shell, had taken to accompanying Frank on his daily inspections of his beehives, carefully masked and gloved against the few winter-hardy bees still protecting their honey stores. She had even begun attending the tiny local school, where the teacher, Ms. Patterson, had welcomed her with a warmth at odds with the town's general coolness toward them. Only 6 other students in her grade, Ms. Patterson had explained when Tina enrolled her. "We've been studying local ecology, actually. Valerie's cabin is right in the middle of one of the most interesting microclimate zones in the region. The school project had given Valerie a reason to explore Theodore's botanical drawings, which she'd carefully removed from the shed and arranged on her bedroom wall. Sometimes Tina would find her daughter with one of the lighter journals open on her lap, comparing Theodore's illustrations to samples she'd collected from around the property. This tentative peace was shattered by a knock at their door one freezing February morning. Tina opened it to find a stern-faced woman in a practical parka, clutching a clipboard and wearing an expression that triggered instant alarm. "Kathleen Burke, Child Protective Services," she announced without preamble. "I need to conduct a welfare check on Valerie Williams." The blood drained from Tina's face. "There must be some mistake," she managed. "No one has filed a report." "Automatic procedure when a child changes schools due to unstable housing circumstances," Ms. Burke replied. already stepping past Tina into the cabin. Her critical gaze swept over the space, noting the primitive conditions despite the recent improvements. "I understand you're living here following financial hardship." The next hour was excruciating. Ms. Burke inspected every corner of the cabin, taking meticulous notes about the lack of running hot water, the wood stove heating system, the absence of reliable transportation now that the SUV had been repossessed, and most damagingly, Tina's unemployment and dwindling financial resources. "You understand my concern," she said finally, her tone professional but unyielding. "Your daughter has experienced significant trauma and instability. This environment," she gestured around the cabin, "raises serious questions about basic habitability standards, especially given the remote location and harsh winter conditions." "We're managing," Tina insisted, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Valerie is attending school regularly. She's well-fed, warm, safe." "For now," Ms. Burke interjected, "but what happens when your funds run out entirely? When the next medical emergency arises? When the snow makes this location completely inaccessible?" She closed her notebook with finality. "I'll be filing my report today. You'll receive notification of a formal hearing within 10 days to determine appropriate next steps." After she left, Tina stood motionless in the middle of the cabin, panic rising like floodwater in her chest. The words, "appropriate next steps," could only mean one thing. They were considering removing Valerie from her care. The very prospect was unthinkable, yet suddenly, terrifyingly real. When Valerie returned from school that afternoon, Tina maintained a facade of normalcy, helping with homework and preparing dinner as if their fragile new life wasn't threatening to collapse around them. Only after her daughter had gone to bed did she allow the full weight of the situation to crash down upon her. The cabin felt suffocating suddenly, the walls pressing in with accusation. She had failed to protect her daughter from Richard's betrayal, failed to maintain stability, failed to build something sustainable from the wreckage he'd left behind. The social worker's critical assessment simply confirmed what she'd been fighting to deny. They were hanging by a thread, and that thread was fraying rapidly. Unable to bear the confines of the cabin any longer, Tina slipped outside into the bitter February night. The cold air burned her lungs, a physical manifestation of the pain consuming her from within. Above, stars blazed with indifferent clarity. In the mountain sky, their distant light offering neither comfort nor guidance. She hadn't prayed since Richard's death. What God would allow such complete devastation to befall them? But now, facing the prospect of losing the only person who mattered, words escaped her lips without conscious thought. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, "please don't take her from me. I'll do anything, anything." The mountain offered no answer except the soft sigh of wind through pine branches. Yet, as Tina stood there, cold seeping through her inadequate clothing, an unexpected clarity began to form. The social worker's visit wasn't simply a threat, it was a deadline, a concrete point in time by which she needed to transform their situation from precarious survival to sustainable living. She couldn't fight the assessment on its facts. The cabin was primitive, her financial resources were dwindling. Their situation was objectively precarious by any standard metric. But perhaps she could change those facts before the hearing. Not all of them, certainly, but enough to demonstrate that Valerie's welfare wasn't at risk, that despite their unconventional circumstances, they were building something stable and worthwhile here. When she returned inside, the chill had been replaced by a burning determination. Sitting at the kitchen table with Theodore's journal spread before her, she began to formulate not just a plan, but a vision. The remedy that had helped Valerie recover from her respiratory infection wasn't an isolated success. In the weeks since, Eleanor had used Tina's preparation of Theodore's arthritis salve with notable relief. and Frank swore her headache tincture worked better than those chemical pills. What if she could transform Theodore's forgotten knowledge into a legitimate, sustainable income source? Mountain Remedies, prepared with the precision of her accounting background, marketed to a world increasingly interested in natural alternatives to commercial pharmaceuticals. The logistics were daunting. Regulations, testing, distribution, marketing, 1,000 details that would normally require substantial startup capital they didn't have. But they did have something potentially more valuable: unique knowledge that hadn't been commercialized or patented, passed down through generations and proven effective through decades of use. Working through the night, Tina drafted a detailed business plan, applying the same analytical rigor she'd once used to streamline corporate tax strategies. By dawn, she had a framework, starting small with simple preparations that fell within herbal supplement regulations, building a local customer base first, reinvesting all profits into improving their living situation immediately. When Valerie came sleepily into the kitchen, she found her mother still at the table, eyes red-rimmed but bright with purpose. "We need to make some changes," Tina said, trying to balance honesty with reassurance. "Someone from the government came yesterday to check if our home is safe enough for you." Valerie's eyes widened with immediate understanding. "Are they going to take me away?" The directness of the question pierced Tina's heart. "Not if I can help it," she promised, "but we need to show them that we're doing more than just getting by, that we're building something real here." She explained her idea in simple terms, using Theodore's knowledge to create remedies they could sell, starting with the preparations that had already helped people they knew. "Like the stuff that made me better when I was sick?" Valerie asked. "Exactly like that," Tina confirmed. "Your great-grandfather knew things about the plants here that most people have forgotten. We could help people and make money to improve our home." Instead of the confusion or resistance Tina half expected, Valerie's expression brightened with the first genuine enthusiasm she'd shown in months. "I could help find the plants," she offered. "Ms. Patterson says I have a good eye for identifying species." The simple offer of collaboration and the glimpse of her daughter's old spark nearly undid Tina completely. "That would be perfect," she managed through the tightness in her throat. That morning marked a turning point. What had begun as a desperate plan to satisfy a social worker transformed into a shared mission that gave them both purpose. Valerie threw herself into the role of plant identifier with unexpected passion, spending hours comparing Theodore's drawings to actual specimens and creating her own notebook of observations. Meanwhile, Tina approached Nancy at the clinic, swallowing her pride to ask directly about the effectiveness of Theodore's remedy for respiratory issues. "I've had 3 patients this winter with similar symptoms," Nancy admitted, after ensuring they weren't overheard. Standard treatments were helping, but recovery was slow. "When I suggested they try your preparation as a supplemental therapy," she shrugged expressively, "all 3 reported significant improvement within days." "Would you be willing to document that?" Tina asked. "Not as a medical endorsement, exactly, but as an observation for the CPS hearing." Nancy hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Theodore Harper helped a lot of people in this valley, including my own family. Seems only right his knowledge shouldn't be lost again." The next breakthrough came unexpectedly through Ms. Patterson, who had noticed Valerie's growing interest in local plants. "We have a visitor coming next week," she told Tina during a parent meeting. "Dr. Elena Martinez from the University of Colorado's Botanical Research Department. She's studying native plant adaptations in high-altitude microclimates. When I mentioned Valerie's interest and the Harper journals, she was quite intrigued." The meeting with Dr. Martinez exceeded all expectations. The botanist, a vivacious woman in her 40s with salt and pepper hair and intense eyes, practically vibrated with excitement as she paged through Theodore's journals. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, examining his detailed notes on cultivation, techniques for particularly sensitive alpine herbs. Harper was documenting phenomena that modern botanical science has only recently begun to understand. His observations on adaptive properties in these microenvironments are decades ahead of their time. When Tina hesitantly explained their situation, the CPS investigation, their precarious finances, her fledgling idea to create sustainable income from Theodore's remedies, Dr. Martinez didn't dismiss her as naive or desperate. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. "The university has a grant program for exactly this kind of knowledge preservation," she explained. "Traditional ecological knowledge with verified efficacy. We've been looking for projects that bridge indigenous or historical plant wisdom with contemporary applications. This could be perfect." For the first time since Richard's death, Tina allowed herself to believe that perhaps they hadn't reached a dead end, but a turning point. One that might lead not just to survival, but to something meaningful and sustainable that honored Theodore's legacy while securing their future. The remaining days before the CPS hearing passed in a blur of activity, with Dr. Martinez's preliminary letter of interest from the University Botanical Department, Frank and Eleanor's written statements about the improvements to the cabin, Nancy's clinical observations about the effectiveness of the remedies, and Ms. Patterson's glowing report of Valerie's engagement at school, Tina assembled a compelling case for their continued presence on the mountain. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold. Tina dressed in her most professional remaining outfit, a simple black skirt and sweater that belonged to her old corporate life, and braided Valerie's hair with hands that trembled only slightly. Whatever happened today would determine the course of their lives moving forward. Everything depended on convincing the judge that their unconventional situation offered Valerie not just adequate care, but the opportunity to thrive. "Ready?" she asked her daughter, kneeling to meet her eyes. Valerie nodded solemnly, then surprised Tina by throwing her arms around her neck in a fierce hug. "We're going to stay together," she whispered with unexpected conviction. "Great-grandpa's helping us from heaven." The simple faith in her voice steadied Tina's racing heart. "Yes," she agreed, returning the embrace. "I believe he is." Ninem. As they stepped outside into the winter sunshine, the mountains spread before them in crystalline splendor. No longer an imposed exile, but a landscape of unexpected possibility. Whatever the hearing's outcome, they had already begun to transform Theodore Harper's forgotten legacy into their own path forward. The county courthouse was an intimidating stone building that had probably stood since the town's founding, its formal architecture at odds with the casual mountain aesthetic of the surrounding businesses. Tina gripped Valerie's hand tightly as they climbed the worn steps, acutely aware of the curious stares from locals who rarely saw the facilities used for anything more dramatic than property disputes or minor infractions. Inside, the hearing room was smaller than Tina had imagined, but no less daunting with its dark wood paneling and formal arrangement. Ms. Burke from CPS was already seated at one table, her familiar clipboard and a thick folder placed precisely before her. She acknowledged Tina with a professional nod, but offered no warmth. "Mrs. Williams," called a voice from behind them. Tina turned to see Nancy from the clinic hurrying toward them, still wearing her medical scrubs. "I came as soon as my shift ended. I thought you might want another voice of support." The unexpected alliance brought a lump to Tina's throat. "Thank you," she managed. They were soon joined by Ms. Patterson, Dr. Martinez, who had driven up from Boulder specially for the hearing, and to Tina's surprise, several other townspeople, including The librarian and even the general store owner who had been so cool to them initially. "Word travels," explained the librarian with a gentle smile, "when people heard what was happening and about Theodore's remedies making a comeback. Well, not everyone holds with old grudges." Before Tina could process this unexpected show of support, the side door opened and the judge entered. A silver-haired woman with penetrating eyes and a no-nonsense expression that revealed nothing of her inclinations. Everyone rose and then settled again as she took her seat. "This is an informal hearing to evaluate the welfare circumstances of minor Valerie Williams," the judge began, reviewing the papers before her. "I understand there are concerns about housing adequacy, financial stability, and general safety, given the remote location and recent life changes." She looked up, her gaze sharp. "Ms. Burke, please present your assessment." The social worker's report was professionally delivered but devastating in its clinical analysis of their situation. The cabin's primitive facilities, Tina's unemployment, their isolation during winter weather, the emotional trauma of their financial collapse, and the recent medical emergency that had highlighted the precariousness of their access to healthcare. While Mrs. Williams clearly cares deeply for her daughter, Ms. Burke concluded, good intentions cannot overcome the objective inadequacies of their current living situation. We recommend temporary placement in a licensed foster home until more suitable permanent housing and stable income can be established. Each word struck Tina like a physical blow. Beside her, Valerie's hand tightened around hers to the point of pain, but the pressure was anchoring. They had prepared for this assessment. They had answers for these concerns. When the judge invited her to respond, Tina stood on legs that felt unnaturally steady, given the trembling in her core. She began methodically addressing each point in Ms. Burke's report, presenting the documentation she had assembled, the improvements to the cabin verified by Building Inspector Frank, the school reports showing Valerie's consistent attendance and growing engagement, the university's interest in Theodore's botanical research. When she reached the medical concerns, Nancy stood to offer her professional assessment of the respiratory remedy's effectiveness and how it exemplified the potential therapeutic value of the Harper formulations. Dr. Martinez followed with an impressive overview of the botanical significance of Theodore's work and the economic potential of ethically commercializing his knowledge. Throughout these presentations, the judge listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but giving no indication of her leanings. When the formal statements concluded, she leaned forward. "I'd like to hear from Valerie," she said, her tone gentler than it had been previously. "Would you come up here and talk with me for a moment, young lady?" Valerie looked momentarily terrified, but then squared her small shoulders and walked to stand before the judge's bench. Tina's heart clenched at how vulnerable she appeared, and how brave. "Valerie," the judge said, "I know this past year has been very difficult for you, losing your father, your home, moving to a new place. Can you tell me how you feel about living in the cabin with your mother?" Tina held her breath. Valerie had been so withdrawn for so long. What if she couldn't find the words now, when everything depended on them? But when Valerie spoke, her voice was clear and unexpectedly strong. "At first I hated it," she said with typical 10-year-old bluntness. "It was cold and scary and not like our old house at all. And I was really mad that Dad died and left us with nothing." The judge nodded encouragingly. "That's very understandable. And how do you feel now?" Valerie considered this seriously. "I still miss our old life sometimes, but the cabin is getting better every day, and I'm learning about all the plants and how to help people with them, like my great-grandfather did. The kids at school used to make fun of me for wearing old clothes, but now they think it's cool that I can identify medicinal herbs and stuff." She paused, then added with sudden intensity, "My mom works harder than anybody I know, She stays up late reading the journals and measuring things exactly right and making sure I have everything I need. We're not just surviving here, we're building something important." The conviction in her voice and the echo of Tina's own phrasing brought tears to Tina's eyes. She blinked them back furiously, not wanting to appear emotional rather than competent. "Thank you, Valerie," the judge said with unexpected warmth. "You may return to your seat now." After a few more questions for Ms. Burke and clarifications from Tina, the judge announced she would take a brief recess to consider her ruling. Those 15 minutes of waiting were perhaps the longest of Tina's life. When the judge returned, her expression gave nothing away. "This is an unusual case," she began, "and one that highlights the sometimes competing factors in determining a child's best interests. On one hand, there are legitimate concerns about the primitive nature of the living situation and financial instability. On the other, there is clear evidence of a loving parent working tirelessly to improve circumstances, a supportive community stepping forward, and a child who is engaged and thriving despite the challenges." She shuffled her papers deliberately before continuing. "The purpose of Child Protective Services is not to ensure ideal living conditions by middle-class suburban standards, but to protect children from neglect and harm. By that measure, I see no evidence that Valerie Williams is at risk. Quite the contrary." Relief cascaded through Tina's body so intensely that she nearly missed the judge's specific directives. They could remain in the cabin provided certain additional improvements were made to the heating and water systems. Tina would provide monthly updates on their financial situation, and the school would continue monitoring Valerie's academic and emotional progress. "Additionally," the judge concluded, "I'm quite intrigued by the potential of this botanical project. The history of this town is intertwined with the Harper legacy, for better or worse, and there may be healing on multiple levels in its revival. I look forward to hearing of your progress." With a single tap of her gavel, the hearing was adjourned. Tina sat momentarily frozen, unable to process that they had won, that Valerie would remain with her, that their fragile new beginning had been given official sanction to continue. It was Dr. Martinez who broke the spell, approaching with outstretched hand. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "Now the real work begins. The university grant application is due in 3 weeks. Shall we schedule some time to work on it together?" The next hours passed in a blur of congratulations and surprising outreach from community members. The general store owner offered Tina a part-time position managing his chaotic bookkeeping system. The elderly groundskeeper from the library, a man of Native American heritage who had barely acknowledged them previously, approached Valerie with quiet dignity. "My grandmother was a healer who worked with plants," he told her. "If you're serious about learning, I could show you some things not in your great-grandfather's books." By the time they returned to the cabin that evening, exhausted but elated, Tina felt as though they had crossed an invisible threshold. The judge's ruling had legitimized their presence on the mountain, but more importantly, it had cracked open the door to community acceptance that had seemed so firmly closed upon their arrival. As she tucked Valerie into bed that night, her daughter's words from the hearing echoed in her mind. "We're not just surviving here, we're building something important." For the first time, Tina fully believed it might be true. The following weeks brought rapid changes. With the immediate threat of separation removed, Tina threw herself into implementing the vision they had presented at the hearing. The university grant application consumed days of intensive work, with Dr. Martinez providing crucial guidance on academic formatting and terminology. The part-time bookkeeping position at the general store provided modest but steady income, enough to fund the required cabin improvements and begin rebuilding their depleted savings. Most surprising was the gradual warming of the town's attitude. It began with small gestures. the cafe owner who refused payment for Valerie's hot chocolate, explaining that Theo Harper once saved my grandmother's leg from amputation with that salve of his. The hardware store clerk who offered discounted materials for the cabin renovations. The mechanic who sold them a battered but reliable old Jeep at a fraction of its value, since you folks need to get around these mountain roads proper. Valerie blossomed under the combined mentorship of her teacher, Dr. Martinez, and Joe Looking Bear, the library groundskeeper, whose knowledge of traditional plant uses complemented Theodore's more academic approach. Her notebooks, filled with careful observations and increasingly skilled drawings. At school, her formerly guarded demeanor gave way to cautious friendships based on shared interests rather than material possessions. As winter grudgingly yielded to early spring, Tina took stock of their transformation. The cabin, while still rustic, now boasted reliable heating, proper insulation, a functional bathroom with hot water, and solar panels that provided basic electricity. Their diet, supplemented by community members who shared garden produce and game meat, was healthier than the processed convenience foods of their former life. Valerie's cheeks glowed with the robust health of outdoor living and purposeful activity. More importantly, they had direction. The grant proposal had advanced to final consideration. The first batch of officially packaged Harper Mountain remedies, starting with the respiratory formula, the arthritis salve, and the headache tincture, were ready for limited local distribution through the general store and clinic's small gift shop. Yet just as they appeared to be finding their footing, nature intervened with cruel timing. The spring thaw, arriving earlier than usual due to an unseasonably warm March, triggered the very disaster Frank had been warning about all winter. A flash flood that tore through the lower section of their property where Tina had meticulously prepared beds for the medicinal herbs they planned to cultivate. In a single devastating afternoon, months of preparation were washed away, seedlings uprooted, carefully amended soil carried downhill in muddy rivers, the modest greenhouse Frank had helped construct, reduced to twisted metal and shattered glass. Standing in the aftermath, rain still dripping from the trees around them, Tina felt a despair that threatened to overwhelm the hard-won equilibrium of recent weeks. "All that work," she murmured, surveying the destruction. "All those plants." Valerie stood beside her, uncharacteristic tears streaming down her face. "What do we do now, Mom? The university people are coming next week to see our project." The question hung in the rain-heavy air between them, all their fragile hopes seemingly as devastated as the muddy landscape before them. Would this setback undo all their progress? Would the community support evaporate when faced with this new challenge? Would the university withdraw their interest when they saw the destruction of their carefully planned cultivation beds? Just as they were about to return to the cabin, defeated, Frank's truck rumbled up the muddy drive. He surveyed the damage with a whistling breath between his teeth. "Damn spring floods. Should have warned you better about this low spot." He shook his head. "You know, there's a reason Theo never planted down here. Always did his growing up in that hidden valley beyond the North Ridge. Protected from the worst weather, perfect southern exposure. Probably where those specimens in his journals came from." "Hidden valley?" Tina repeated. "I didn't know there was anything behind the ridge." Frank nodded. "Not easy to spot unless you know it's there. Trail's overgrown now, but I could show you. Might be worth taking a look if Theo's plants were growing wild anywhere on this property. That's where they'd be." The simple offer rekindled a spark of hope. Perhaps not all was lost. Perhaps, like so many times before in this unexpected journey, what initially seemed like disaster might actually be redirecting them toward a better path. "Could we go now?" Valerie asked eagerly, the tears already drying on her cheeks. Frank's weathered face creased in a smile. "No time like the present. Grab your notebooks and some gathering bags. Old Theo might just have one more surprise waiting for you." As they followed Frank up a nearly invisible trail that switchbacked up the ridge behind their cabin, Tina reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The woman who had arrived here in designer boots, unable to light a wood stove, was now confidently navigating rugged terrain in well-worn hiking boots, a collection bag slung over her shoulder and a comprehensive mental catalogue of local flora at her disposal. Whatever they found beyond the ridge, whether salvation for their project or merely another challenge to overcome, she knew with sudden certainty that they would face it together, stronger than they had ever been in their previous life of material. In comfort, but emotional disconnection, the trail crested the ridge and then descended steeply on the other side. Tina caught her breath as the hidden valley came into view, sheltered by surrounding peaks and verdant with early spring growth. Sunlight bathed the protected basin, creating a microclimate noticeably warmer than the still wintry slopes they had just traversed. "Look!" Valerie cried, pointing toward a section where patches of purple and blue flowers dotted the landscape. "Those are the same as in Great-Grandpa's drawings." Frank nodded in satisfaction. "Figured they might still be growing here. Valley's been undisturbed since Theo's time, except maybe by deer and the occasional bear." As they descended into the valley, the floral diversity became increasingly apparent. Many of the species Theodore had documented most extensively in his journals grew here in surprising abundance, protected from harsh weather and human interference by the valley's natural isolation. Tina's scientific training from her accounting days kicked in. "This is remarkable," she breathed, recognizing plants they had only seen in Theodore's illustrations. "It's like a living seed bank of his work. Some of these species are quite rare, according to Dr. Martinez." Valerie was already carefully photographing and cataloging their findings, her natural aptitude for botanical identification now honed by months of study. "This changes everything, Mom," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "We can collect seeds and cuttings without disturbing the main populations. It's way better than the beds we were trying to create." The discovery of the hidden valley seemed to confirm what Tina had begun to suspect, that Theodore Harper had been not just a talented herbalist, but a deliberate botanist who had created a sustainable system for cultivating and harvesting his medicinal plants. The valley's isolation had preserved his work through decades of neglect, waiting for someone to rediscover its purpose. As they gathered carefully selected specimens for Dr. Martinez to examine, making certain to take only what could be sustainably harvested, Tina felt a profound sense of connection to this place and to the grandfather-in-law she had never met, but whose legacy was now shaping their future in ways she could never have imagined. The flood that had initially seemed like a devastating setback had actually directed them to a far more valuable resource, one that might not only save their project, but elevate it beyond their original vision. In this hidden valley, protected from the worst of mountain weather and human interference, Theodore Harper's botanical knowledge lived on in the most literal sense, waiting for his descendants to continue the work he had begun. "Mom," Valerie said as they made their way back toward the cabin, collection bags filled with carefully labeled specimens. "I think Great-Grandpa Theodore led us here. Whether by spiritual guidance or simply the practical logic of an experienced botanist whose work they were gradually coming to understand, Tina couldn't say. But looking at her daughter's face, animated with purpose and genuine joy for the first time since their world had collapsed, she felt a surge of gratitude toward the reclusive man whose forgotten legacy had offered them not just survival, but renewal. The future that had seemed so bleak just months ago now stretched before them, filled with unexpected possibility. The path would not be easy. Mountain living never was. But they had found something here that had eluded them even in their previous life of material comfort, a sense of purpose, connection, and genuine belonging. As the evening sun gilded the hidden valley behind them, Tina felt certain that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them with the resilience and wisdom they had gained from this mountain and from Theodore Harper's enduring legacy. Have you or someone you know ever experienced a major life upheaval that ultimately led to discovering hidden talents or unexpected new directions? Let me know in the comments. The day that changed everything dawned innocent of its own significance. Spring had fully arrived in the mountains, transforming their property with vivid green growth and the first colorful wildflowers. The hidden valley behind the ridge had become the cornerstone of their botanical project, with carefully managed harvesting and propagation efforts supervised by Dr. Martinez to ensure sustainability. Tina had just returned from her morning shift at the general store, where her organizational skills had transformed the chaotic bookkeeping system into an efficient operation that saved the owner considerable money, earnings reflected in the steadily increasing hours and pay she received. The modest income, combined with the first successful small-batch sales of Harper Mountain Remedies through local outlets, had stabilized their financial situation enough that the monthly reports to CPS now reflected cautious optimism rather than desperate hope. She was preparing lunch when the rumble of an unfamiliar vehicle drew her attention. Through the kitchen window, she watched a sleek black SUV navigate the improved but still rugged access road to their cabin. The vehicle's luxury and obvious newness stood out starkly against the practical, weathered trucks and jeeps typically seen in the area. "Are we expecting someone?" Valerie asked, looking up from the kitchen table where she'd been pressing flower specimens between waxed paper. "Not that I know of," Tina replied, wiping her hands on a towel and moving toward the door with curious apprehension. The man who emerged from the SUV was expensively dressed in what appeared to be an attempt at casual mountain wear. Crisp new jeans, a designer flannel shirt, and hiking boots that had clearly never seen a trail. Behind him, a woman in a tailored pantsuit carefully picked her way across the muddy yard. "Mrs. Williams?" The man extended his hand with practiced confidence. "I'm Gregory Chamberlain. This is my associate, Sarah Prescott. I hope we're not intruding." The name landed like a stone. Chamberlain, the family whose feud with Theodore Harper had shaped so much of the community's initial hostility toward them. Though the current doctor had been professionally correct during Valerie's follow-up appointments, he had maintained a cool distance that reflected the generations-old tension. "What can I do for you, Mr. Chamberlain?" Tina asked, not bothering to hide her wariness. His smile never faltered. "I think it might be more about what I can do for you. May we come in? I have a proposition that could be quite beneficial for your situation." His gaze swept over the cabin with a barely concealed assessment of its rustic simplicity. Tina hesitated, then stepped back to allow them entry. Inside, Gregory Chamberlain seemed too large for the space, his presence somehow diminishing the improvements they had worked so hard to make. "Charming," he commented in a tone that suggested the opposite, "very authentic." "Thank you," Tina replied dryly. "What proposition brings you all the way up our mountain road, Mr. Chamberlain?" He settled himself at their kitchen table after a moment's hesitation, as if assessing whether the chair might soil his immaculate genes. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Williams. I'm aware of your enterprise with the Harper formulations. Word travels in small communities." He smiled thinly. "My family has significant business interests beyond our medical practice, including Chamberlain Wellness, a regional distributor of natural health products." The woman accompanying him placed a glossy folder on the table. "We've been monitoring the remarkable response to your small batch products," she added in a clipped professional tone. "The market for authenticated traditional formulations with demonstrable efficacy is expanding exponentially." Gregory leaned forward. I'm prepared to make you an extremely generous offer, Mrs. Williams. Chamberlain Wellness would purchase the Harper formulations outright, complete rights to all remedies documented in Theodore's journals, plus exclusive harvesting access to the plants on this property. He named a figure that momentarily stole Tina's breath, enough money to clear their remaining debts, purchase a comfortable home in town, and provide for Valerie's education through college. And beyond, the financial security that had been stripped away by Richard's gambling could be restored in a single transaction. "You could move off this mountain," he continued smoothly, sensing her reaction. "Back to civilization. Your daughter could attend a proper school again. You could resume your accounting career without this charming but primitive detour." The offer hung in the air between them, its promise of instant resolution to their struggles undeniably tempting. No more worrying about winter storms or difficult access roads, no more makeshift adaptations to primitive conditions, a return to the comforts and conveniences of their former life. "What exactly would happen to the formulations?" Tina asked, striving to keep her voice neutral. "We would standardize them for mass production," Sarah explained, opening the folder to reveal slick marketing mock-ups. "Our labs would analyze the active compounds, optimize extraction methods, and scale manufacturing, while maintaining efficacy. The Harper Heritage branding would emphasize the authentic, traditional nature of the formulations." "And the valley, the plants?" Tina pressed. Gregory waved a dismissive hand. "We'd harvest what we need. Our team would manage the resources efficiently." Something in his tone raised alarm bells in Tina's mind. Efficiently sounded suspiciously like completely. "We'd need some time to consider your offer," she said carefully. "This is quite unexpected." "Of course," Gregory smiled confidently. "Business decisions shouldn't be rushed. Take the weekend to review the proposal. We'll need your answer by Monday. We have other opportunities in the natural wellness space. If this doesn't align with your vision..." After they departed, Tina sat staring at the glossy folder, emotions warring within her. The money was real, life-changing in its immediacy. They could walk away from the struggles of mountain living, return to material comfort and conventional security. Valerie could have new clothes, technological gadgets, all the trappings of their previous existence. "Mom!" Valerie stood in the doorway, her expression troubled. "Are we going to sell great-grandpa Theodore's remedies to that man?" The simple question crystallized Tina's swirling thoughts. "What do you think we should do?" Valerie considered this with serious deliberation. "I think great-grandpa Theodore wouldn't have wanted his plants just harvested efficiently." She made air quotes around the phrase. "He took care of them. That's why they're still growing after all this time, and..." She hesitated. "I don't want to move back to the city. I like it here now." The admission startled Tina. When had her formerly urban daughter become so attached to this remote mountain existence? Yet looking at Valerie, healthier, more confident, engaged with meaningful work that connected her to her heritage, the transformation was undeniable. "We don't have to decide right away," Tina assured her. "Let's talk about it with Frank and Eleanor. Maybe Dr. Martinez, too." The weekend brought a parade of unexpected visitors once word of Chamberlain's offer spread through the small community. Eleanor and Frank arrived first, concern evident in their weathered faces. "You've got every right to take that money," Frank said bluntly. "God knows you've earned some ease after everything. But..." He gazed out the window toward the ridge that concealed the hidden valley. "Some things can't be replaced once they're gone." Nancy from the clinic stopped by with information that added crucial context to the decision. "The Chamberlains have been trying to develop the north side of the mountain for years," she explained. "Luxury vacation homes, a boutique resort. The hidden valley would be prime real estate for their centerpiece property." Joe Looking Bear, the Native American groundskeeper who had been mentoring Valerie, arrived with a solemnity that added gravity to the discussion. "My grandmother spoke of working with Theodore Harper," he told them. "He understood something most outsiders never learn, that we don't own this land. We are merely its caretakers for the generations to come. The plants you've discovered are not just commodities, they are living heritage." Most surprising was the arrival of Edith Peterson, the town's elderly newspaper editor, clutching a manila folder of her own. "Been researching town history for our bicentennial," she announced. Without preamble, "Found something you should see before you make any decisions about those Chamberlain vultures." The yellowed newspaper clippings and town council minutes she'd unearthed told a story dramatically different from the narrative that had shaped the community's initial hostility. Theodore Harper hadn't refused to help the Chamberlain girl out. Of spite, he had tried desperately to obtain a specific plant that grew only on Chamberlain property, a crucial ingredient in the remedy that might have saved her, but had been denied access by the girl's vengeful father. More shocking were the subsequent records revealing how the Chamberlains had leveraged the tragedy to turn public opinion against Theodore, systematically acquiring properties around his land at depressed prices and establishing the business empire that now dominated the region's economy. "They've been trying to get their hands on the Harper property for generations," Edith concluded. "That valley is the last piece of their development puzzle, and your formulations are just a bonus prize." By Sunday evening, when Dr. Martinez arrived for their scheduled project meeting, Tina had reached a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. The botanist listened to their account of Chamberlain's offer and the community's response, then added her own perspective. "The University Grant Committee was impressed by your preliminary work," she explained. "They're prepared to fund not just documentation of the Harper formulations, but establishment of a sustainable botanical research facility. It wouldn't be immediate wealth like Chamberlain offers, but it would provide living wages, scientific validation of Theodore's work, and most importantly, preservation of both the knowledge and the ecosystem that supports it." The contrast between the two paths before them could not have been starker. Chamberlain offered quick financial salvation, but at the cost of everything they had built, and likely the destruction of Theodore's botanical legacy. The university partnership promised a slower but more sustainable future that honored not just the formulations but the entire ecosystem and knowledge system Theodore had protected. When Gregory Chamberlain returned on Monday, his confident smile faltered at finding not just Tina and Valerie waiting for him, but a substantial portion of the community gathered at their cabin. "I appreciate your generous offer," Tina told him firmly, "but we've decided to decline. The Harper formulations aren't simply products to be commercialized. They're part of a living botanical tradition that deserves preservation and ethical development." His expression hardened. "Mrs. Williams, I don't think you understand what you're turning down. Your rustic adventure here is charming, but hardly sustainable. Winter will come again. The novelty of poverty will wear thin." "Perhaps," Tina acknowledged, "but we're not alone anymore." She gestured to the gathered community members. "And we have a different vision for Theodore's legacy. One that doesn't involve stripping the land for profit." Gregory's pleasant facade cracked entirely. "You'll regret this decision. That valley would be better utilized for development than wasted on a few weeds, and I assure you, one way or another, Chamberlain Enterprises will eventually acquire that and property." As he stormed back to his luxury SUV, Tina felt not regret, but a profound sense of certainty. They had chosen the harder path, yes, but one aligned with values deeper than mere financial security. The true turning point wasn't Gregory Chamberlain's offer, but their rejection of it, a declaration that they were no longer the desperate outsiders who had arrived in a blizzard months earlier, but members of a community with a vision worth fighting for caretakers of a legacy worth preserving. That evening, as twilight settled over the mountains and their friends departed, Tina and Valerie stood together on the porch of the cabin that no longer felt like an exile, but a home. "Did we make the right choice?" Valerie asked, leaning against her mother's side. Tina gazed toward the hidden valley, invisible beyond the ridge, but present in her awareness like a promise. "Yes," she said with quiet conviction. "Some things are worth more than money. Your great-grandfather understood that. Now we do too." The decision marked not just a rejection of Chamberlain's offer, but an embrace of the path they had been discovering since their arrival. One that connected them to this land, to Theodore's knowledge, and to a community that had initially rejected them, but now stood by their side. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not as desperate survivors, but as purposeful stewards of a legacy reborn. Tina stood on the creaking wooden porch long after the others had gone, watching the last hints of twilight fade behind the jagged peaks. The quiet that followed Gregory Chamberlain's stormy departure was not emptiness, but the gentle reassurance of nature reclaiming its space, a promise that the land and its secrets were not for sale. Valerie, leaning close beside her, traced patterns on the frost that still clung to the rail. In that moment, the small, determined family felt the weight of their decision and its hopeful implications. They had chosen to protect a legacy that was intertwined with the soul of the mountain and the people who respected its rhythms. In the days that followed, life settled into a rhythm that was both challenging and profoundly rewarding. Tina immersed herself in finalizing the university grant proposal. Every evening, after long hours managing the general store's bookkeeping and supervising small but essential repairs to the cabin, she would return to the kitchen table surrounded by Theodore Harper's yellowed journals, notebooks filled with Valerie's careful botanical sketches, and a scattering of letters of support from community members. With steady determination, she organized plans for a botanical research facility that would not only document the Harper formulations, but also create a sustainable income stream for the community. The proposal described a modest research center dedicated to studying the rare plants of the Hidden Valley, incorporating both modern scientific methods and traditional ecological knowledge. Dr. Martinez contributed her expertise, reviewing Tina's drafts and suggesting ways to bridge the gap between academic research and the lived heritage of the mountain folk. Valerie, now brimming with a quiet confidence, became the center of her own small world of discovery. Under the watchful eyes of Joe Looking Bear and Ms. Patterson, she spent her afternoons in the Hidden Valley. The valley, with its sheltered microclimate and wild diversity of alpine herbs, was a treasure trove of living history. She learned to distinguish the delicate petals of mountain avens from the stouter leaves of wild thyme. She discovered that even the smallest changes, a shift in the color of a blossom or the direction a vine curled, could hint at deeper ecological messages. In those moments of exploration, she felt connected to her great-grandfather in a way that transcended the mere passage of time. The valley became her classroom, and every plant a teacher. The community, too, began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. The rejection of Gregory Chamberlain's offer sent ripples through the town that ultimately led to more than just a victory for Tina and Valerie. Neighbors who had once been indifferent or even hostile now saw in them a beacon of authenticity and resilience. The general store owner, once curt and businesslike, began greeting Tina with friendly nods and even shared local anecdotes about old family recipes passed down through generations. At the library, Edith Peterson continued to champion the historical significance of Theodore Harper's work, organizing small exhibitions that paired newspaper clippings with displays of the original journals and botanical illustrations. Even those who had doubted the viability of the Harper formulations now expressed cautious optimism, eager to support a project that promised to revitalize the region's cultural heritage while offering genuine natural remedies. One crisp morning, as the first blush of spring color transformed the snowbanks into a palette of muted greens and soft pastels, a meeting was held in the modest community center. Dr. Martinez had arranged a gathering to discuss the emerging research center and to invite local participation. The room was filled with a mix of skeptical locals and hopeful innovators, all listening intently as Tina outlined her vision. She spoke about sustainable harvesting practices, community-based research initiatives, and the potential for integrating traditional healing methods with modern health practices. Her voice, though still carrying traces of the pain and fear of recent months, resonated with an uncharacteristic firmness that reassured the room. Valerie sat near the front, her notebook open and pencil in hand, ready to jot down ideas as if she were charting an unexplored map. When she spoke up to suggest organizing field days in the Hidden Valley, her words sparked murmurs of agreement and enthusiasm among the attendees. Over the following weeks, plans for the research center began to take shape. A small building near the cabin was repurposed to serve as a laboratory and teaching space, its walls soon adorned with sketches, maps, and diagrams detailing the various plant species of the area. Frank and Eleanor, ever the steadfast supporters, assisted by lending tools and practical know-how in retrofitting the old structure. In turn, Tina's financial acumen helped secure microloans from local cooperatives that recognized the long-term value of preserving the mountain's botanical heritage. The partnership with the University of Colorado, facilitated by Dr. Martinez's persuasive correspondence and the compelling evidence contained in Theodore Harper's journals, promised not only a steady infusion of research funds but also periodic visits by eager students and experts willing to lend their insights to the project. Late one evening, as a gentle rain began to patter on the roof of the renovated lab, Tina sat alone at her desk. The soft hum of conversation from the small group gathered around a makeshift dinner table downstairs drifted upward. In that quiet moment, she reflected on the arc of her journey. Once, she had been a high-powered accountant in a sleek office tower in downtown Denver, her life defined by spreadsheets and corporate hierarchies. Now, she found meaning in the minutiae of plant morphology and the delicate balance of an ecosystem. The trials that had shattered her former life, the betrayal, the financial ruin, the near loss of her daughter, had given way to a profound transformation. In the chaotic interplay of nature and nurture, she had discovered a new kind of wealth, the wealth of community, heritage, and resilience. Valerie knocked softly on the door and entered with a bright smile that belied the hardships of the past months. "Mom, look at this," she said excitedly, holding up a freshly pressed wildflower, its petals a vivid burst of color against the soft lamplight. "I found a new species along the ridge, a kind that might have medicinal properties too." Tina's heart swelled with pride and tenderness. In that moment, the future no longer seemed like an uncertain risk, but a canvas of possibilities, painted with the hues of hope and the wisdom of ages past. Their lives, once dominated by the specter of loss and desperation, now pulsed with the promise of renewal. Each new day brought its own challenges, the unpredictable mountain weather, the constant need for adaptation, and the lingering shadow of economic insecurity, but also an unyielding determination to honor a legacy that had been nearly forgotten. Tina resolved to document every step of their progress, not only for the purposes of the grant proposal, but also as a testament to the transformative power of hope. She began keeping a detailed journal, echoing the style of Theodore Harper, recording their successes and setbacks with a clinical precision tempered by personal emotion. Months later, as summer crept into the mountains and the wildflowers reached their full bloom, the research center held its inaugural open house. The event drew a modest but passionate crowd of locals, university students, and even a few skeptical businessmen who had come to see for themselves what the Harper Heritage Project was all about. Valerie, now more confident and articulate than ever, led a guided tour of the hidden valley. She explained the importance of each plant, relating them back to the ancient illustrations in the journals, and demonstrating how the traditional remedies were prepared. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and even the hard-edged businessman could not help but be moved by the palpable sense of community and purpose. During the open house, Tina reconnected with many of the people who had doubted her when she first arrived in the mountains. The general store owner congratulated her on her financial turnaround, remarking that the new bookkeeping system was not only efficient but also infused with a kind of care that was missing in modern business practices. The librarian, Edith Peterson, proudly displayed an article from the local paper featuring the project, describing it as a renaissance of forgotten wisdom and a triumph of community spirit. Even Joe Looking Bear, who had long taught Valerie the sacred lore of the land, nodded approvingly as he watched the young botanist explain the significance of each specimen with a maturity beyond her years. For Tina, that day marked not only a milestone in the project, but a personal vindication. She had reclaimed a piece of her identity that had been lost amidst the chaos of her former life, a sense of purpose anchored in the natural world and in the relationships that bound her. To a community that, despite its initial hostility, had grown to accept her as one of its own. In the warm glow of the late afternoon sun, as she embraced Valerie amidst congratulatory cheers and gentle laughter, Tina understood that they had not merely survived the storm, but had learned to dance in its aftermath. Even as challenges loomed, on the horizon, the uncertain future of grant funding, the perennial battle against nature's whims, and the ever-present pressure of economic survival, Tina and Valerie had forged a new path, a path that was not defined by what they had lost, but by the enduring legacy of a forgotten botanist and the deep, unyielding connection between a mother and her daughter. They had discovered that true wealth lay not in material possessions or the fleeting comforts of urban life, but in the preservation of history, the nurturing of community, and the relentless pursuit of hope. And as the mountains stood silent witness to their journey, Tina and Valerie moved forward into a future bright with possibility, bound together by love, purpose, and the timeless wisdom of the land. Congratulations, Type 9, in the comments, so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.